The viewpoints expressed on Night Fright are not necessarily those of the host, the staff, the sponsors, or the affiliate stations. Tonight's program may contain graphic themes or images. Viewer discretion is advised.
There is a time for question. There is a time for answers. There is a time to challenge. There is a time to speculate. There is a time for change. There is a time for truth. The time is now. Welcome to Night Fright, your voice in the dark for horror and conspiracy. And now your host, Brent Holland.
Showtime. Welcome to the show, everybody. Happy New Year. Brand new year. We're starting off 2016, and none better to start the show off with than a real heavy hitter. You know, folks, in the late 1970s, a show was released that virtually turned the entertainment industry on its head. That show was called Real People. The creator and host of that show is our guest tonight, John Barbour. Are you ready for this, folks? He's won not one, not two, not even three or four. He's won five Emmys. Now, John's a Canadian. I have to say that right away. Which, of course, folks, means, of course, he's going to win 5 Emmys. Born in Toronto and is an avid Maple Leafs fan, although we won't hold that against him. I'm a Habs fan, John, by the way, just to let you know. Now, John grew up, just a kid growing up in the early 30s and the 40s, so he went through the Second World War. We're going to get to that. I want to get some of his thoughts and feelings of what that was like to go through. John's here tonight because, as fans of this show will know, he's been here before talking about the JFK assassination. John's working on a new documentary called Last Word on the Garrison's Tapes. Now, this is a documentary, folks. John was able to spend 3 hours speaking directly to none other than Jim Garrison. For folks on the show that are listening right now that are unfamiliar with Jim Garrison, I simply reference you to the movie JFK. That is Jim Garrison being portrayed by the very competent Kevin Costner. Jim Garrison was the only person to bring a trial against the perpetrators of this heinous crime against none other than President John F. Kennedy. Now, I don't want to spend all my time in a blurb in the beginning. I want to get to John, and I want to welcome you right away, all the way from Las Vegas, where you've just suffered a torrential downpour on the golf course. Now, I just want to preface this by saying we are freezing our toes off here in Canada. So I'm so glad you were out in the golf course today. That makes me feel good. Welcome back to the show, John. Thank you for joining us.
Brent, thank you so much, and a happy New Year to you too. You know, I was out, and I love to play golf, even though I'm emotionally ill-equipped to play the game, and it's the only place where I ever use profanity. And God help those people who live in a golf course, because after I played 18 holes, there are a lot of for sale signs go up. But I got to the 18th hole and I was doing okay, and then a downpour struck me, and I thought, my God, you know, the Scotch must have invented whiskey the day after they invented this game, just so they could play it. And you know, the amazing thing is, you said I was a make-believe fan. When I was probably from the ages of 9 to 12, I lived on a street called Lawler Avenue in the east end of Toronto, yes, on the same street as Adam Beck High School. That I got. You know, it was Adam Beck Public School, and I'm telling you, In those days, Brent, if you sauced anybody, they would take you into the principal's office and they would take out a strap. It was a rubber strap that was melted onto iron filings. And to make it worse, it came out of a vase of water, but just not ordinary water. It was lemon water. So if the principal was lucky enough to slice your hand and make you bleed, you suffered more when the lemon went in there. And I'll get to Maple Leaf Gardens in a second. I just got to tell the story. I never saw fat people when I was a kid in Toronto. Didn't see them at all. Now it's almost impossible to see thin people. And you know, when I hear people talking about going on a diet and complaining, they just have to remember, no fat people ever came out of Auschwitz. Okay? Just stop eating, for crying out loud. And the reason they go to all these places that diet is they're looking for company. They're not looking to get thin. Anyway, because I was almost sort of an Oliver Twist, David Copperfield, Charles Dickens kind of orphan, because you mentioned the Second World War. Well,
Yes, sir.
my father left when I was 6 just to get to the peace and quiet of the Second World War. I almost never saw my mother, and when I did, I had a new uncle coming into the house.
Oh,
So
Lord.
my defense mechanism, I guess, was my mouth. I wasn't big, so if I was going to get into a fight, I had to defend myself with my mouth. And we had a very fat teacher in the 8th grade, and I remember his name. Can you believe this?
Wow.
His name was Hetherington. And he was forever complaining. And he had to have an extra large seat to sit at his desk. Anyway, one day he comes into the class and he leans against his desk and he says, "Oh, God, my ankle's swollen." And I said out loud, "How can you tell?" Well, they grabbed me and took me to the principal's office. And I skipped a couple of grades because fortunately I was bright. It was nothing I had anything to do with it, just that I was bright. And the grades I didn't skip, the classes I didn't skip, I played hooky on. I spent all my time down at St. John's, which was a reformatory down there, and playing hockey in the wintertime. Anyway, I used to go to Maple Leaf Gardens, 9 to 13, 50 cents for standing room only.
Wow.
You will not remember this name. He died about 2 or 3 years ago, but my very, very favorite player was a defenseman named Wally Stanowski.
Now, wait a second. That name does ring a bell, though, honestly.
Now, what you will remember, probably, you might have been a kid at the time, maybe not even born, I don't even think.
No, I wasn't born.
Ted Kennedy, whenever he got the puck, the crowd would be on their feet hollering, "Come on, Teeter." But Wally Stanowski was by far the best skater on the team. He wasn't with the team long, but that's the one I would go to watch all the time, was Wally Stanowski. And now I was sad. I am no longer a Leafs fan. I'm a Kings fan. I started at the Forum when there were only 12 or 1,300 people, and myself and John Perry, who's Matthew Perry's father, and a really good actor named Bo Swenson, started the celebrity hockey team. And the celebrity hockey team, I understand, is still going strong. And I was really disheartened a couple of weeks ago when your Leafs won. But you know why they won? Poor Bernier. He can't stop anything. He couldn't stop a bus if he were standing in front of it, for crying out loud. And he gets to go in goal, and I told my son, who has season tickets to Ken, Bernier is going to win his first game because it's against his old team. It's just too bad that every other team hadn't traded him. Maybe he'd had a few more wins by now.
And there we have it, folks, on the Canadian, the team from, well, they call it Canada's team. I don't, of course, because I'm a Montreal Canadiens fan. But there's a lot of folks up here that just live around the Toronto Maple Leafs. and God
Well,
loved him.
speaking of the Habs, it is remarkable that Price, the goalie, is so important to that team. I mean, they
Isn't he,
started
though?
off with
Yeah.
9 or 10 straight wins. He must be a wonderful human being, because I accidentally saw a short film about him. Evidently, he was raised half Indian. I'm not quite sure about that. And the documentary is about what he was bringing back to an Indian nation in British Columbia, I believe. He just seems to be a remarkable man, and what a talent as a goaltender.
Incredible, the best in the league, some would argue, without question.
Well, you know, all this started because we were talking about golf. The thing is that I loved hockey. And, you know, that's what I wanted to be as a kid. And I remember this teacher's name too. I was in the sixth grade. The teacher's name was Miss Britton, and she was a very pretty unmarried woman. And she one day asked all the class what they wanted to be when they grew up, and kids stood up and they said they wanted to be Lorne Greene, or they wanted to be Gordon Sinclair, or they wanted to be a policeman or a fireman. They got to me and I stood up and proudly said, I want to be another Wally Stanowski and play for the Toronto Maple Leafs. And when every other kid stood up, all the other kids cheered if they said they wanted to be prime minister or whatever it was. She said right away, nobody ever makes a living playing hockey. That's not a very good choice, young man. And it just took the heart out of me. So I never, I always loved the game. I just lost my interest because I thought, you know, it's bad enough that my family doesn't want me. Now my teacher doesn't want me, for crying out loud. So, but the thing is, in all sports, you ad-lib your physical moments. And I think one of the reasons that sports are so popular, it is the only thing in which you see excellence at work on television. You certainly won't see it in the White House here. You won't see it in our presidential campaign down here. I'm telling you something, Brent. If baseball was like our presidential candidates, the two worst goddamn teams would be playing off in the World Series. But the thing is, in golf, you have to repeat the same motion. And you would think that would be simple. Once you've hit the ball perfectly, you could do it a second time. But for some reason or other, it just doesn't work out that way.
Wow. Folks, we're speaking with John Barbour tonight, and he's worked with some incredible folks. I'm gonna get you to tell some stories tonight. Stories about Sinatra, working with Tom Snyder, Red Fox, as a matter of fact. Oh, there's so many you've worked with, all the top-notch people. I want to get to the Garrison tapes. Now, can you tell a brief synopsis of how the Garrison tapes came to your possession and how you decided to make something of a documentary with these tapes?
Well, I'll try to tell it as quickly as I can. And the prologue to that will be that everything great that happens in my life, and I'm sure it's true with most people's lives, everything wonderful happens by accident.
Yes, sir.
Because the disasters are always those things that are well planned. And it was only an accident that I met Jim Garrison. I had started as my career as a comic when I returned from England. I'd gone to England to try to track down my father, spent a year at a repertory company there, and was very successful, but gave it up because I was make-believe. It was pretending. I didn't want my life, Brent, to be pretending. I wanted it to be real. I wanted to be in California, because when I would go to the Manor Theater in Kingston Road when I was just a kid, at the end of it said made in Hollywood, so I wanted to be where they made movies. Well, when I got into television, in the United States, a company could only own 7 stations. And they had a thing called the Fairness Doctrine. So when I had Reagan on the show, I had to have a Democrat. When I had a Democrat on, then I had to have a socialist on. Any political party that could prove they could get 5% of the vote, you'd put them on the air. Anyway, Somebody called me and said they're starting this morning show on ABC because they want to make brownie points with the FCC because Chicanos are challenging the license and they want to create a news show. Okay, so I accidentally won the host searching contest and ended up doing the show. Won my first Emmy there, and like overnight, it became the show to do in Los Angeles. Well, I got the show in 1970. Jim Garrison arrested Clay Shaw in 1967. He literally solved the case in 1967, saying the CIA did it. Now, I paid no attention to that, Brent. I mean, I was only interested in the news because he used to write jokes about it. That's why. And management was stunned. I was so well informed, but I didn't become informed intentionally. It was just to write jokes and make a living. So every station in America, every newspaper in America just savaged Jim Garrison, saying it was a kook. And I said to a couple of friends of mine, I said, hold it, I'm off of the streets, so I haven't been educated in your universities or the University of Toronto. I didn't even get out of Malvern Collegiate. I was out of school when I was 15, a dropout of Malvern at the first grade. Okay, but I am street smart. And what I'm going to say to you is if Jim Garrison has nothing, the government should get out of his way and let him get into a courtroom and fall on his ass. But they did everything to hinder it. I lost my friends because they believed the government. Why wouldn't they believe the government? Okay, he lost the Clay Shaw trial. But what people don't realize, he didn't lose the case because what he was looking for was a conviction for perjury because Clay Shaw, Bertrand Russell said he didn't know David Ferry or Lee Harvey Oswald. And he had 70 witnesses from Clinton who saw them together. They had photographs of them. He wanted, it's like the RICO Act in this country. If the FBI gets you on the RICO Act, racketeering, conspiracy to commit a crime, they can threaten you with 20 years in jail for perjury and then you blab. He wanted that from Clay Shaw, but the government stepped in and prevented the prosecution of Clay Shaw. Okay, so now it's all over with and the government begins. Well, in 70, I get the show. I'm 4 months into the show, and I'm in a bookstore one day, and I pick up a book. It says Heritage of Stone by Jim Garrison. I thought, my gosh, is that the same guy? So I started reading. I didn't leave the store. I read half the book. I ran home, finished the other half next morning, 9 o'clock. It's noon in New Orleans. I pick up the phone. I called Jim Garrison's office, and this bass baritone voice answers, beautiful voice, says hello. And I said, could I speak to Mr. Garrison, please? He said, speaking. And I said, my name's John Barbour, Mr. Garrison. I just read Heritage of Stone. And he giggled and he said, oh, you're the other one. I only sold 2 copies. I loved the man immediately. Look what he'd gone through, and he's got this sense of humor. So I said, listen, I just won my first Emmy. We have the most popular show on the West Coast. You must come out here. It's live. I will do this interview with you. And Brent right away said, John, you'll never get away with it. I said, we are bumping heads with the Today Show. We have a staff of 4. They have 30 people, and we're beating them. He said, well, good luck. I would love to do it. I booked him. We booked him first class. He was going to stay in a great hotel. We booked him 2 weeks off. And within that 2 weeks, I was fired and replaced, and Jim Garrison was canceled. So I ended up a year later doing the reviews on Channel 11.
Can I just interrupt you, John? Why
Sure.
were you fired? Because you booked Jim Garrison?
It seems evident, but I didn't let it bother me. And the reason I didn't let it bother me, and I didn't even think about that, was because, show business is extremely tough. No job in show business is permanent. I got into it knowing that,
No, I understand that, but you just won your Emmy. You've got a rocketing show, and all of a sudden they let you go because Jim Garrison's coming on the show.
Phil Donahue. Look at that war criminal, George Bush, that lying son of a bitch who should be hanging at the end of a rope like Saddam Hussein, who was raised by us and the Central Intelligence Agency. Phil Donahue was the most popular host on CNBC, and he had a couple of people on who were questioning George Bush wanting to go into Iraq for weapons of mass destruction when it was already proven there weren't any. And they fired Phil Donahue. And you know what that jerk president of CNBC said? We fired him because he wasn't waving the flag enough. Well, God damn it, in the United States, journalists are not supposed to be waving the flag. They're supposed to be waving the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. And they fired a guy who was their most successful host. So that's what has happened to America. What has happened, and I must tell you this, Bill Clinton is the worst president in the history of the United States. And why he is out there still getting $500,000 for speaking gigs and campaigning for that bitch. Do you remember when they offed Gaddafi?
Sure.
If I were Bernie Sanders, I would be pulling out this news clip of that bitch on television talking about the death of Muammar Gaddafi when she said, we came, we saw, we killed. Ha 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 ha, and cackle like the wicked witch of the north that she is. I mean, this country has the most despicable presidential candidate. You know, they talk about the fact that Americans are being dumbed down.
Yes, sir.
There is a reason they're being dumbed down. I will get back to the Garrison tapes because
no, this is important, though, John, because your perspective is essential.
It began with the murder of John Kennedy. First of all, remind me about why Clinton is so the worst president. Maybe
he brought in that thing that divested all the television shows, so
that is right.
He broke down that 7 ownership.
That is absolutely right. Now, let me tell you about the business of dumbing down. The Vietnam War, which was another lie, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and another war criminal, Lyndon Johnson and McNamara, all should be hanging besides the Bushes at the end of rope. As a matter of fact, George Bush Sr. said, here is the head of the Central Intelligence Agency that this stupid nation votes in as president of the United States. Can you imagine what would have happened if the head of the secret police in Russia had become president of the Soviet Union? We would be all over them, but we allow it in our own country. Anyway, at one time he said, if they really knew what we were up to, we would be hanging by our necks. And nobody picked that up, but the truth is, there are dozens of them that should be hanging by the necks in Washington, D.C. We would just have to build more lampposts from which to hang them. But anyway, the Vietnam War was lost because of Walter Cronkite. Uncle Walter said on the air, I don't think this war is winnable. And bang, it was over. It was totally over. But the reason the war was lost, Brett, they drafted middle-class children. And middle-class children were being killed. And so the middle classes took to the streets. In America, they voted with their feet. And in Chicago, they almost shut down the whole country. It was all over. As a matter of fact, when the riots started in Chicago, they have since, it started with a American flag being torn down from a statue in Lafayette Park. They have found since that it was a CIA agent and an FBI agent who tore down the flag to start the riots.
Oh.
It's indeed a false flag. And I'll tell you something else. If the Stars and Stripes is supposed to stand for the Bill of Rights and the Constitution in the United States of America, that is the biggest false flag in the world. And maybe the dumbest president in our history was Abraham Lincoln when he made that foolish remark about believing in government of the people, by the people, and for the people. I mean, right now, when CEOs in America hear that, they laugh their asses off, for crying out loud. The 1% select. The 90% elect. They have no choice in the process. But anyway, what happened is when the war was over, the owners of the country said, you know, we cannot draft people anymore. we're going to have to build an army and get people to enlist in the army. Well, how do we get them to enlist in the army? Well, first of all, they have to have no place to go to work. It is similar to the end of the Second World War. You know, the major depression was not even solved by the Second World War. I mean, it did put a lot of people to work. But when that Second World was over and you got 2 million men and women in uniform coming back to the United States, how many goddamn toasters and cars can they make, or radio sets can they make? But because if you make them, they got to last a while. So what do? You make munitions because you can blow them up in a minute and then charge the taxpayers more money to make another one that they can blow up the next minute. The Cold War was probably fake, as is all this trash that they're involved in now, these phantom terrorists that don't even exist, for Christ's sake. They have no planes, they have no boats, they have no army. How can they cross the Atlantic or Pacific to get to the United States? It's all bullshit. Anyway, what they do is they dispense with jobs. And how do they do that? They go to Bill, one of their hirelings, and they say, hey, we can't have jobs in manufacturing here anymore. What can we do about that? Bill says, let me sign NAFTA and send all those jobs over to Asia and China and Japan and Mexico. So that's what they do. Okay, so now what happens if they can't get jobs? Well, the chances are they may have to go into the military. But what if they're smart? Well, we can fix that. We'll just dumb down the educational system. Friend, I know 3 young men, 20 years of age, honor students, are going into the army because they can't find a job in this country and they don't want to be flipping burgers, okay?
Yes, sir.
So,
same here. Same in this country as well.
Well, it's happened.
Yeah.
Fortunately, and I don't know much about the young man that you just voted for as the prime minister. But thank God he said after he was elected that he was going to be pulling out of some of these fake wars and he was going to legalize pot. Had he said it before the election, I'm sure the Americans down here would have sent up all their stormtroopers to make sure that he never got into office. So he was smart enough not to say it. To say it afterwards. Anyway, to get back to the Garrison thing, I ended up as a film critic. I was the first one in America to review movies on the news. Now they're like weather people. Anyway, Tom Brokaw saw me, brought me over to NBC in Los Angeles, where I was Tom Snyder's sidekick for 5 years until he got the Tomorrow Show. And I only one time. I forgot about Garrison, and then I was still doing stand-up, and I remember doing a stand-up on television. It might have been the Dean Martin show. I made a comment about Watergate was an important American event that almost put America on the brink of democracy. Well, it got an ovation from that crowd, and I got a call from Jim Garrison. He just loved the joke. Wanted to know if he could quote the joke. So we talked about the Vietnam War, and we talked about Watergate, and he mentioned a couple of names from Watergate that had appeared in his investigation into the Clay Shaw trial. So that was the last time I spoke to him. Then I ended up.
Can you tell the folks those names, or do you want me to?
You do that. Please do that.
Okay.
You're an expert on that.
Those folks that were involved were anti-Castro Cubans, and there was Dave Morales, I think, was one. There was E. Howard Hunt, Frank Sturgis.
There were a half a dozen of them. I think that one of them was named Gonzalez. I can't remember because it was such a fleeting conversation. And then
they were all tied to the JFK assassination.
Yes,
by the way.
Absolutely. Then I got a call from a fellow named George Slaughter, who had been the co-creator of that original wonderful show, Laugh-In, and he asked me if he could take some of my lines from my reviews, and he would pay me as a writer and put them on Laugh-In. So I said to him, hey, George, I got a better idea. I said, why don't you let me just write my own stuff, and you have a critic at large on Laugh-In. You give me 20 seconds, 30 seconds. He said, great idea. So I ended up, it was a Laugh-In revival where we introduced most wonderful man and most wonderful talent, Robin Williams.
Ah.
You did not have to write for Robin. You would just say, "Hi, Robin, how about?" You couldn't even finish the sentence, and he would be off. Absolute comic genius. He and Jonathan Winters were two peas in a pod. I mean, they were so magnificent. Anyway, that's how I met him. And then, so I was on the show. The sad thing about the show, and the sad thing about the demise of the show, first of all, the man who really created this thing was an English drunk named Digby Wolfe, a very witty man, unfortunately an alcoholic. And he got the idea of Laugh-In because we were having in America all these things called sit-ins. So why not call this Laugh-In? So that became the name. And then Rowan and Martin became the hosts. And people loved Rowan and Martin. They were perfect for the show. And Slaughter became jealous of them. And they got in fights all the time. And that show, which should have gone on for 10 or 15 years, better than Saturday Night Live, ended in 3 years. Slaughter had a way of being destructive and envious of people from whom he stole their material. But in any way, what happened is Sinatra and Laugh-In was shot without audiences. It was always an empty stage, and the stars would come on, they'd do their stuff, and then put in canned laughter afterwards. Well, the stage is empty when Sinatra comes on, and he's accompanied by 2 or 3 Italian Praetorian Guard, and he is handed material by Slaughter, and Francis could be very, very, very tough and cruel sometimes, and he would look at the material and say, "George, this is shit." He wouldn't even hand it back to him. He'd just throw it onto the floor. "Hey, George, this is shit." Anyway, Digby hands him another sheet, and Sinatra reads and say, "Yeah, I like this, I like this, I like this." So he said, "Who wrote this?" So Digby points up to the very, I was afraid to even sit in the front. I mean, being that close to Sinatra. So I'm sitting in the very back of the studio there, and he says, "Johnny up there, he wrote that. Hey, kid, come here." So I stumble down the stairs, and I go over, and he shakes my hand, and he said, "This is good stuff. I'd like to talk to you afterwards." So afterwards, he said to me, I do a lot of special gigs and engagements and stuff, and sometimes I have to write letters to the editor, angry letters to the editor. How'd you like to do that for me? And I said, "I'd be delighted to do it." And he said he was going to pay me $1,000 every time I wrote one line or one letter. I said, "No, I do it for nothing." He said, "Nobody works for me for nothing." As a matter of fact, he was close before he got from here to eternity.
Mm-hmm.
He was going to commit suicide.
Oh, really?
And Ava Gardner, he had lost his voice for 6 months. And, singers, if they don't use their voice right, they get what they call nodules. They're like blisters, right? Poor Julie Andrews, who was just the most lovely soprano, got the same thing. And like an idiot, went to a surgeon and had them removed. Now she can't sing anymore. Oh. Sinatra was smarter. He just shut up for a half a year. But he was going to kill himself because he didn't know whether or not he could sing again or he'd ever work again. And Ava Gardner went to Harry Cohen and said, "You're going to hire Francis to play Maggio in From Here to Eternity." And that literally saved Francis's career. Anyway, I forgot where I was going talking about Sinatra. Anyway, ask me another question. And
Sinatra had asked you to do some writing for him.
Yes, I did. So we were very, very close for about 4 years. And then one day, after about a year, I went to him and I said, Crosby had been dead for about 2 years. And I said, "Francis," he wanted those people that he thought were friends to call him Francis. And I couldn't call him Mr. Sinatra. He wouldn't answer. He'd always say, "Hey, John, it's Francis, it's Francis." So I went to him and I said, "Francis, you know what? I would love to do with you an Italian Roots." And he said, "What on earth are you talking about?" I said, "Well, this thing on ABC called Roots with Kunta Kinte about this black kid who came from Africa, and they're running it every night."
Alex Haley's book.
Alex Haley's book. Yeah. Some of it plagiarized.
That I didn't know.
Yes, and he had to pay a massive lawsuit for that too. But in any event, what happened with Sinatra. I said, Bing Crosby died on a golf course in Spain. There you go, golf. Okay, he's not physically equipped to play the game. He died on the damn golf course. And I said, he is gone and forgotten. I said, he was probably, until you came along, the greatest pop singer in the world. Okay, but you don't hear him anymore. You don't hear him anyplace. I said, but I'm telling you, Francis, long after you're gone, there won't be an Italian restaurant in America that doesn't play your song night after night and song after song. And the reason for that, you weren't just an entertainer or an actor. I mean, Bing Crosby got more Academy Awards than you. He had as many hits as you, but you were a social force. Do you realize if you and the Rat Pack hadn't sung High Hopes for John Kennedy, he would have still been a senator, for crying out loud. You were a cultural force. So what I would like to do is I would like to bring a camera to your place in Palm Springs. You will never see me on camera or hear my voice. I'm going to ask you questions about your life. We're going to put about 10 hours of this stuff together. I'll edit it down to 5. I will talk to people who love you and hate you. Over 5 generations, I will find lovers who got married listening to your songs. And I said, and I'm also going to ask you some really tough questions. And one of the first ones I'll ask, no, I said, not the first because I want you to be comfortable. I'm going to ask you about Sam Giancana. And he stared at me. I mean, he stared at me cold, and he has steely blue eyes. And he said, I beg your pardon, kid? I said, Francis, when I was 16 and came down from Canada, I thought I came here because I was going to be a professional gambler. I had read John Scarney on cards and John Scarney on dice. I was the best gambler I knew. And I ended up at Lake Tahoe at the Cal Neva Lodge. And I'm only 16, but I'm dressed like I'm 28 or 29. I look rich. I got a rich blue suit on. I'm wearing a Stetson. They think I'm a Texas cowboy who has as much cattle as I have hat. And I'm betting good and I'm doing good. And all of a sudden, everybody around the crap table stops. And nothing stops the crap game, right? Even the stick man stops, and he just holds up the stick like he wants everybody to stop. And they're turning around, looking behind me, and I turn around, and guess who I see? I see you arm in arm with Sam Giancana. And behind you, 3 very large Italian friends.
I should just tell folks right away, if you're not sure who Sam Giancana is, Godfather of Chicago, very, very heavyweight gangster.
Not only that, we'll add a little to that. First of all, when Sinatra got part ownership in the Sands Hotel, he lied about his relationship with Giancana or any gangsters. Sam Giancana, as the chairman of the board of the mafiosa in Chicago and a major player in the assassination of John Kennedy, was scheduled to testify before the House Select Committee. And he was shot in the back of the head while he was cooking lasagna by his closest friend. And when he lay on the floor face up, his friend put 6 bullets around his mouth as a warning not to talk, okay? And I was convinced that Sinatra had heard something about the assassination from Giancana, but I didn't want to mention that to him until we were in the privacy of his home. Anyway, he said, write up the presentation, kid, and send it over to Dorothy. Dorothy was his secretary. So I wrote it up, 2 pages, sent it over. And I said to him, I said, you realize this is the first time in history, instead of writing a book, a famous personage is going to do a visual autobiography. And who better than Frank Sinatra? Well, he was beside himself with delight and looking forward to it. Okay, he called me the very next day, 2 days later. Kid, we're going to be on. Well, what happens? I can't do it. And the reason I can't do it, I've just created Real People, which gets on NBC by accident. I had it for a year, Brent, at ABC, and it was called National Graffiti. And the reason I called it National Graffiti it was a takeoff on the National Enquirer because I got a lot of my stories out of that. And that great American movie, American Graffiti, just a classic film. So anyway, I go and I meet this guy, Lou Ehrlich. God, it's a stunning thing that I remember these names from so long ago. And I tell him I want one of my co-hosts, there are going to be three of us, to be Richard Pryor. And Ehrlich leans over the counter, dark hair, dark eyes, and says, that nigger's never getting on this network. Now, I can understand why he said that, because Richard had just done a couple of specials at NBC, and one of the programming executives unwisely edited out one of the scenes that Richard happened to love. And Richard went into his office and punched him in the face. Oh. Then a few days later, he's arrested by the IRS for not paying his income taxes, and as I'm pitching him to Lou Ehrlich at ABC, he's in prison or he's in county jail downtown in LA. So I could understand it, but I said to him, you don't realize this kid in Oakland puts 5,000 asses in seats in a theater. He's going to be a star one day, but they pass on it. Now, Digby Wolf, the co-creator of Laugh-In, has a contract with Westinghouse. He calls me when he hears about this, and he said, Westinghouse wants me to develop a show. Could you bring that thing over and talk to me about it? I said, sure, where are you? He said, I have the office across from Slaughter in Slaughter's building on Beverly Boulevard. I said, okay, I'll be over there tomorrow at 11 o'clock. So I go over there, but Digby's on the phone. Digby loved to talk, and he was a good talker. I'm sitting in the lounge area waiting for him, and Slaughter comes out of his office and sees me. I haven't seen him since working on Laugh-In. He said, what are you here for? I said, well, I'm supposed to see Digby. And he said, what about? He said, well, he asked me to come in and talk to him about his development deal. He says, come on in and talk to me a bit. So he began to ask me about what happened at ABC, and I told him. He said, how would you like to do that show here? And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I have a contract to do 4 specials called Country versus City. Country jokes versus city jokes, country music. City. He said, but your thing sounds so much easier. And he said, besides, I got a call from Silverman asking me. Silverman had just become the head of NBC. Could you do a show, George, based on real people? I don't know what I'm talking about, but I've heard that phrase so much lately, and I heard that ABC was considering something like that. So he said, and we'll call it Real People. And I said, why would you call it Real People? It's such a common phrase. I got National Graffiti. He said, John, because Silverman suggested it, I want to make sure he buys it, okay? So you're going to learn about show business. So that's how it came about, quite by accident. And I did not produce, even though I did actually produce, the 4 specials went to 6. He didn't give me credit for it. So right away, what happens is NBC asked George for 13 more. And he said to me, we're being picked up. And I said, I'm not being picked up unless I'm producing the show. And he said, I can't have you producing the show. I can't have a chance of a lawsuit from ABC for crying out loud. And I said, I don't care. I'm not coming back. Now listen to this. I was almost broke. I was almost always broke, Brent. I never in my life did a job for money. I only did what I loved because that's what made me feel alive. It made me feel like I wasn't an orphan. It made me feel like I was my own best friend, and I didn't care if anybody else didn't like me. I liked myself. I liked my work, and I wanted to get credit for my work. So I didn't come back. I confronted Silverman in a meeting one night. I said, you know, if I don't come back to Real People, it's in the toilet. Well, Silverman looked at me like I was a piece of crap. And I said, Mr. Silverman, you don't realize it, but I am more important to that show than is Carol O'Connor to All in the Family. The important one to All in the Family is Norman Lear. That's the guy that writes the stuff. I'm the guy that writes this show. It's a writer's show. Well, he thought all you do is put a camera on Real People and that's it, and it works. It doesn't work that way. And I said to him, are you familiar with the jumping frog of Calaveras County? He said, every idiot is. I said, do you know how many times a story about that was written? Do you know any of the writers in the newspapers who wrote about it? It only mattered when Mark Twain wrote it. Now, I don't mean to sound arrogant, Mr. Silverman, but I am the Samuel Clemens of real people. Well, he thought I was full of crap, and I loathe the man for that, okay? And always will loathe the man for his insensitivity, not only to me, but his lack of intelligence about knowing what works on television, because he put such trash on television. Anyway, George succumbs, congratulates me on having been a really good gambler. So eventually it paid off. And I asked him for a piece of the show, and he said to me, this shit isn't going anywhere. You can't syndicate it. I said, George, then you have nothing to lose if you don't give me a hunk of it, okay? If it's not going anywhere, we'll both not go anywhere together. So he did. And that's how I ended up having Green's Feast the day go and play in a windstorm. Within 10 weeks, we were now going to do 22 weeks. No show in history was picked up for 22 weeks. We had a 50 share in Chicago. We had better ratings than All in the Family, Sanford and Son, MASH, all of them. Of course, when I left the show over the Garrison thing, actually.
Tell us about that. What happened with the Garrison thing?
Okay, so what happens is when you have a successful show in television, they never come to the creator. They go to the guy that owns it. They went to Slaughter and said, hey, we want to do a takeoff on network. Remember the movie with...
Sure.
I'm mad as hell. I'm not going to take it anymore. Peter Finch is Howard Beale, okay? So that's the kind of show that they want to do with people on the street shouting and yelling. And so they did it. Herb Brooks, bless his heart, the coach of the Miracle on Ice team that beat the Russians in 1980, became good friends with him and his wife. Sadly, she divorced him because she hated being in Hollywood. Marjo Gortner, a child evangelist, was co-host, and a really, really bright, beautiful black lady was the third, just gorgeous woman. Anyway, George is incapable of doing anything on his own. He has to have people. He could be sort of like a good coach and that good kind of manager, but he was not in the least bit creative or tasteful. And he would come to me all the time asking me to help him with the show because it was not doing well. I was working 20 hours a day on Real People. George, I can't do it. I don't have the time. Then one day by accident, Brent, I pick up the LA Times. Middle of the paper, it says the House Select Committee has concluded 4 shots have been fired in Dealey Plaza. Therefore, conspiracy had to exist. I had talked to Jim in about 8 years, so I pick up the phone and I call him again. And I said, Mr. Garrison, I never ever called him Jim. Mr. Garrison, do you feel vindicated? And I read him the article. And listen to what he said, Brent. He said, John, I feel like a blind man in a very dark room that got a very small trophy. Only I know I got it. And I thought, God damn it, that man is so smart. I said, well, didn't you send the material? You weren't going to testify? And he said, listen, they tore up subpoenas for me back in the late 60s, Helms and all of these jerks at the CIA. And if they subpoenaed me, I was going to tear it up too, let them take me to court. He said it's a sham anyway. He said they've already dumped the guy that could have solved the case, and that was the fella out of Philadelphia. God, what was his name? I will think of it in a minute.
Spector?
Yeah.
Or Blakely?
No. Blakely was the CIA guy.
Okay, so Arlen Spector.
No, it wasn't Arlen Spector. He was the magic bullet guy.
Right.
God dang it. I will think of his name beforehand.
I'll try and think of it too. Sorry.
Okay, tough lawyer, still alive. His son is still in practice.
Sprague. Yes.
Sprague, Richard Sprague. That's it.
As soon as you said tough, I knew who you were talking about.
Yes. Okay, so there you go. Well, Sprague has a staff of 6 people immediately. He tells the 6 people, the first thing we do not do is hire CIA or FBI. We are going to solve this case. Well, the CIA hears about that, and they call him, and they ask him to come over to Langley for an interview. He said, no, I think the interview will be conducted in my office, and on your way over here, stop by your file cabinets and fill up a SUV or a panel truck with some of your documents because I'd like to look at them. Well, immediately what the CIA did is they go to their assets in the media, in the Senate, and in Congress. I'm going to put that on pause for a second while I remind you and your audience, in the middle 70s, a terrific senator named Frank Church conducted the only public hearings into the Central Intelligence Agency. And what did they find aside from all these assassination plots and poison plots and the rest of it? They found the names of 1,000 Central Intelligence assets on the payrolls of CBS, NBC, ABC, Time Life, Esquire, every single media in America. And the head of the CIA once said, we'll know we've succeeded when every American believes what they want them to believe. Okay, now that's 1970. We're fighting this fake war in Vietnam, okay, but with real victims, sadly. But it's still a fake war. Now we have no real visual enemies. It's all ghosts that the government is creating for us. So how many Central Intelligence Agency assets do you think they have infesting the American society to this day? Not only are they in the media and in the government and in Congress, they're in the schools and they're in the JFK assassination research community. That's why nothing is done when you see all these conferences, for crying out loud, with all these great minds and great information. Nothing is ever done because they're sabotaged from within. Anyway, they get rid of Sprague and they replace him.
John, going back to the conferences, have you run into not CIA disinformants, but misinformants that are purposely there sent by the government?
Absolutely. The place is littered with them, and I'll get to that in a second, how it occurred to me. Anyway, Blakey comes in. He has to conclude, or they have to conclude, that 4 shots were fired, so assassination, a conspiracy had to exist in the murder of him and Martin Luther King. Yeah. And what happens is Blakely publishes a book blaming the mafia for the killing. Now, you and I all know if the American government felt the mafia killed the President of the United States, there would not be a pizza parlor in America. Okay? And to whom does he dedicate the book? The Central Intelligence Agency. Now, what does that tell you? And this guy Blakely, last year at a place called ARC, A-R-C, I think it is one of the better sites back in Washington, D.C. Guess one of the speakers was?
Blakely.
Robert Blakey.
Yes,
I called Joan Mellon, who's a dear friend of mine and one of the best researchers ever, the best writer ever when it comes to telling Jim Garrison's story. And I yelled at her. I said, why are you speaking where Blakey is speaking? You should sit in the audience and scream at him. And she said, John, as long as I get to be able to tell my point, she said, but I am sort of disappointed. So anyway, I go to New Orleans, and here's what Garrison said to me. I said, because he said, you know, I haven't talked to anyone, John, in 10 years. I just can't talk about it anymore. And I said, does that mean you're not going to tell me this story because I want to come down there and put you on camera finally? He said, okay, but bring a Real People t-shirt. So anyway, we go down there. I put him on camera for 3 hours. It was the most terrifying, uplifting, magnificent, informative time I have ever spent in my life. It was so American. And speaking of American, sometimes, Brent, when you're around somebody, they can say something totally unrelated to what you're talking about that will make you feel that you believe everything they've said previously. And this happened with me and Garrison, even though it was obvious. He gave me the documents and everything, so everything he was saying was true, and he backed it up with documentation. When we were done, I said, Mr. Garrison, you were a former FBI agent. I said, you were the first person in a district attorney's office to hire a woman, and you didn't prosecute that black writer for the fire next time when he was arrested in your jurisdiction because you said he had a First Amendment right? I said, you're in the reserve. You're not politically aligned. Whatever made you think you could take on the federal government? And you know, he had a picture in his office, the only picture of himself. He was at Dachau when it was liberated, and he's sitting on the fence, and it says, "Lest I ever forget." It's the only picture he had in his office. So I said to him, whatever made you think you could take on the federal government? And Brent, without missing a beat, he said, John, I guess as a kid, I saw one too many Frank Capra movies. Well, that is so true. That was true of me. When I was a semi-orphan and in the Manor Theater for a nickel seeing double features, for crying out loud, I loved Frank Capra. Jimmy Stewart and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. That's what I loved about America, and that's what I love to be. So anyway, two of the important questions I asked him, well, I asked him three. I said, if you were Attorney General of the United States right now, whom would you arrest? And he gave me three names. He also gave me the name of the guy that gave Lee Oswald the orders to shoot Jack Ruby, which is included in the last word on the assassination, which is at Amazon. You can download it for a couple of bucks. But anyway, one of the questions was, how many shooters were there? And he said 3, John. He said, it was a military operation. They call it triangulation, okay? He says there's the shooter and there's somebody to pick up the shell, but this is the most important killing of their lives. So they'll probably have a radio man. So I'd say there were 3 teams of 3. One team was at the Daltex building, and there were 2, one up by the Grassy Knoll. Also, I didn't put it in the documentary, but he believed a shot came from the sewer. And,
okay.
We have pictures of Jaffe, who was one of his investigators, a photographic investigator. We have pictures of him in the sewer on Jim's behalf. So
You've only got 30 seconds left, my friend.
For the show?
Yeah.
Oh my God! Forgive me! Oh, I can't give you the punchline.
Let me extend this invite to you. The show exists on the other side of the hour. Do you want to stick around?
For 10 or 15 minutes so I can finish it?
Yeah.
You don't mind?
No, not at all. It's just we're going to be taking a break in about 30 seconds.
The JFK Assassination, the definitive book by Brent Holland. From inside the Oval Office to Dealey Plaza, first-person witness accounts. Order yours right now. NightFrightShow.com.
And we're back, folks. Welcome back to Night Fright. Get the coffee going, get the tea going, get a beverage of your choice going. Got a great guest tonight. We're continuing in this second hour because we just ran out of time. And when you have a guest like John Barbour on, who's our guest tonight, by the way, folks, he's won 5 Emmy Awards. You will remember him for sure for the creator genius of Real People. And he's done all kinds of amazing things, too. One of the things he's done is he spent 3 hours, I think John just said, 3 or 4 hours with none other than Jim Garrison. Now, Jim Garrison, just to give a quick reference, quick context, was the only lawyer from New Orleans Parish. He was to contest, if you will, legally in a courtroom the verdict of the Warren Commission, which that it was only one lone nut assassin that killed JFK. Not so, according to Mr. Garrison. He knew and was proving there was a conspiracy. And he came up against all kinds of government intervention to put him down, etc. The best reference I can give you for that story right now until John's documentary comes out is the movie JFK with Oliver Stone. I want to go back to John, and I want to thank him for sticking around for the second part of the show. Thank you so much, John. Let's continue, shall we?
Well, listen, let me join in on that canned applause for you for coming back. And I'm sorry that I went so long, but I get so angry. You know, many people. I started up by telling you I was playing golf, and when I go out on a golf course, I usually walk the course, and guys half my age are getting into a cart and riding it all the time. People think I'm taking Dick Clark pills or something like that, and they say, "What on earth keeps you so young?" And I said, rage, anger. And they said, what are you talking about? I said, listen, I found the fountain of youth. And they said, where? I said, it's the United States of America. You can't live here without being in a constant rage at what they're doing to destroy not only this country, but the world. So,
John, what's the biggest thing that's pissing you off right now, besides this host?
No, no. It's almost, there are so many truths that are being covered up. And you mentioned the Warren Report.
Yeah.
And I'll get to the business of the show, which was called Speak Up America, and what happened to me and why I had to leave the show unwillingly. Is one of my really good friends in Los Angeles was Dean Martin. Dean Martin was the most professional entertainer I ever met. We would rehearse in an empty studio. And even if somebody got up who was unknown to rehearse, if anybody talked or chattered or whispered, Dean would go over and tell them to be quiet. He was always prepared, unbelievably, and a very sweet man. He one time gave up $1,000 golf match to play golf with my six-year-old son, and he took my son in the course for 18 holes. They played all 18 holes, and I was about 8 years ago. I was sitting down, remembering that, and I was going to write him a letter, thanking him once again for that. And the day I wrote the letter, he died. He died brokenhearted because his son had died in a plane crash. But he loved my material. I was on his show 3 or 4 times. Anyway, one of my early because I'm saying this because you mentioned the Warren Report and Jim Garrison, and you never heard a joke ever on television about that. But in the dress rehearsal that we had, what they did is they do the dress rehearsal, then they'd make notes, and then you do the show right after that, which was taped, and then they would show it later. So I'm doing this routine. I'm down here from Canada, and I'm telling them that my mother is Jewish. My father is Scotch, which proves that you can mix anything with Scotch. And I said, but I had a really tough time growing up. I mean, you don't know how difficult it is to learn to play Hava Nagila on the bagpipes. And every time I go to synagogue, I was the only kid with a plaid skull cap. I mean, really stupid, silly stuff, right?
To say nothing about a kilt.
Yeah. So anyway, the audience loved it. Anyway, the producer of the show, Greg Garrison, and if you're interested in a great showbiz story later, I'll tell you about him because he saved Dean's show and Dean's life. Anyway, he comes to me and he said, John, you know, that's cute, but I saw you do that in the Merv Griffin show, and it is cute, and the audience obviously loves it. I don't know, though, I don't want to hear any Jew jokes right now on Dean's show. He said, you know, could you do anything topical that might last a while, a couple of years? And, we got from now to showtime till you do it. And I said, well, I don't know, could you give me a few minutes? He said, yeah, take all the time you want. So they take a break, and I go over by myself to a booth. At this time, Lyndon Johnson's daughter is engaged to a guy named Charles Robb, who is in the Air Force. And there was soon to be a huge wedding, right? Thousands of people are going to be at this wedding. And it's announced that Earl Warren is going to perform the ceremony.
Wow. And
so I'm thinking about this. So a joke comes to me. So I go to Greg and I wave my hand. I said, I have a joke. Would you like to hear it? No, go ahead. It's clean, isn't it? Oh, yes, absolutely clean. And then the standards and practices guy comes over to Greg and says, well, I think I'd like to hear it first. And Greg said, it's clean. What can it be? Leave the kid alone. So anyway, it's time to do the actual show and the taping. So I say to the audience, you've just seen in the papers, folks, that Linda, the daughter of Lyndon Johnson and Lady Bird, is engaged to this guy, Charles Robb, and they all nod. And I said, and the wedding's going to come up soon. There are going to be thousands of people there. And Earl Warren has called and said he'd like to perform the ceremony. And they all nod and smile. And I said, but Lyndon Johnson said no. And the audience stares at me. I said, you want to know why? He said, listen, after the war report, I don't want to look back in 20 years and find out my daughter isn't really married. Well, the audience, they cheered. I mean, some people stood up and they were applauding and applauding and applauding. I've only heard one bigger hand, and that was for Red Fox, and I could tell you that story later too. So anyway, I hear cut, cut, cut. They literally stopped the show. Standards and practices, the guy in the blue suit runs out. Greg comes down. That joke is not for this show. And I said, but it's clean, it's harmless, it's not for this show. So Greg puts his arm around me and says, tell me about the Jews again. Anyway, we're doing Speak Up America. There's so much material with Jim Garrison that I have to break it down into two parts. And the opening scene is just breathtaking. It opens up with Jim with that huge face, full screen, 60 minutes full screen, big bulbous eyes, and this deep, beautiful voice saying, Lee Harvey Oswald had nothing to do with the assassination. As a matter of fact, he didn't even fire a shot. Well, the audience they literally sit up and lean forward and are spellbound by this. There's a huge ovation afterwards. After the show, I get home. Now, at the time, I was making on Real People $22,000 an hour and $11,000 for a rerun. So that was $33,000 an hour, almost $1 million a year. So with the newfound funds, I was building a house a block away from Bob Hope's, and I was renting a place. We go back to the rented place, and I called Jim in New Orleans, and he's thrilled. His family is thrilled. And I said, well, next week is part 2, and I'm so relieved. And he's thanking me. He said, John, it's the first time the media has never interrupted me. They've never cut me off. They've never done anything. So now I put together the next piece, right? Now, I had done all the interview with Garrison, but what I did is I put Marjo, who was the host of the show, on camera, gave him 5 or 6 questions, and then cut him in my place. And one of the questions, now comes on part 2, huge applause. We get to the middle of the story, and Marjo says to Mr. Garrison, how many shooters were there? And we cut to Garrison. There's another close-up. And he says, 32. Because I had asked him how many people he thought actually were aware of the assassination. And he said no more than 32.
Oh my God, they spliced it all up.
Yeah, so I started screaming at the set, literally screaming. The phone rings and I pick it up and it's George Slaughter. And Slaughter says, what do you think, kid? And I scream at him, what did you do? What did you do? He said, Garrison's a kook. He deserves it. I said, you have maligned that man. The man is not a kook. You're the kook. He said, he's an idiot and he deserves it. And I said, I hope he sues your goddamn ass off and I'll be his chief witness. This is recorded. I had recorded Slaughter and I hung up. I called Garrison and I'm crying. I can't stop. The only time I ever cried in my life, except in a movie called Goodbye, Mr. Chips with Robert Donat. The only time I ever cried. I was sobbing, and I said, I don't know what happened. I don't know what happened. Please sue him. Please sue him. He said, John, calm down. I'm not going to sue. He said, if I sued everybody who maligned me, John, I would never be in my office or see my family. I'd be in courtrooms all day long. We love your show. We want it to stay on the air. And he said, here's what I'll do for you, too. He said, I'll give you the name of the fake Oswald who's in prison back east. If you go back there and give him a Real People T-shirt, he'll probably tell you his story. I mean, that's how calm and decent the man was. The next day, I confront Slaughter in his office. We're almost in a fist fight. And then I confront the girl, Donna Cantor, who is my best friend's daughter I hired for the show. She's now a successful documentary filmmaker. She was the field producer on the show. What happened? She told me that Slaughter called her at midnight like a goddamn vampire and brought her in and they re-edited the show. Well, needless to say, My days at Real People were numbered, and the show died a horrible death, in spite of the fact, you see the Vietnam Memorial Wall in Washington, D.C.?
Yep.
If it hadn't been for a story that I'd done, it might not even be up. The Missing Children's Act with John Walsh, if I hadn't told Adam Walsh's story, the Missing Children's Act may not have been passed. I got the Navajo Code Talkers a presidential citation. All these glorious things that happened with the show, the huge ratings. You can almost not even read about the show anymore. That's how degraded the property became after Samuel Clemens left the show. Now, I left you with the business of Sinatra, wanting to do the Sinatra roots. Now I'm free, and I figured I could do the show, and I would be more famous for doing that probably than forever doing Real People, and a whole lot richer, because Sinatra was going to get, I wanted to do it for nothing. Sinatra wanted to give me a piece of it, and it would have been worth millions and millions, and it would still be running to this day. It would have been 5 hours of Sinatra telling his life story all on his own. So anyway, what happened is the 50th, the thing with, I knew a fellow who had written the best book about the Sirhan. It's called RFK Must Die.
Oh, sure.
The fellow's name was Robert Blair Kaiser. He was a former priest, and he got into interview Sirhan. He interviewed the psychologist or psychiatrist who hypnotized him all the time. It's a great book. It's still a great book called RFK Must Die. We were close friends, and so he knew of my situation with Garrison, so he came by and left me his book one night and some papers. And I said, "Why are you giving me this stuff?" And he said, "I'm leaving the country." He said, "I'm afraid for my life." So he left. Now, I think Robert is still alive in his middle to late 70s. So I read the book, and I become fascinated with it. And then I meet Thomas Noguchi's lawyer. What has happened is that the city of Los Angeles and the police department have for years tried to get rid of Thomas Noguchi. And the reason for that was that when Noguchi performed the autopsy on Bobby Kennedy, which you can see, it's all public domain, he said the fatal gunshot wound was not more than 2.5 to 3 inches from the left rear behind the ear, because of the extensive powder burns to the skull and to the hair. Well, Sirhan was no more than 6 feet in front of Bobby Kennedy, and they had been trying, the city and the FBI and everybody, to get him to change it. And he kept saying, "I'm not saying Sirhan didn't do it. I'm just saying what I found. All those other conclusions are up to you." And they wanted to get rid of him. So anyway, it's time to get together perhaps with Sinatra to start shooting the first weekend of this. And the lawyer comes to me and asks me if I would participate or help him maintain or retain Thomas Noguchi as the independent coroner of the city of Los Angeles. And I said, "Well, how can I do that? I'm not famous anymore." He said, "Listen, you were just on Real People. You're one of the most famous people in the country. We'll form a committee." So he and I formed a committee called the Committee to Retain Thomas Noguchi as an independent coroner. Okay. We spoke to thousands of people that cheered when we used to tell the story of Thomas Noguchi coming from Japan, still speaking broken English. His hobby is painting. He made a painting for me, which I still have in my bedroom. And now what happens is weird things happen to me, because when I actually got to take that 3 hours and go out on my own and shoot the actual Garrison tapes, I didn't have any money. I mean, I had money, but I didn't want to spend my wife's house money on this. And it was 1992 when Oliver Stone, as you mentioned, decided he was going to make JFK. And so I thought, this is the time for me to make this. I've got this 3 hours. So I called Oliver's office, told his secretary, this is John Barbour, I'd like to talk to Oliver. She come back after a couple of minutes. He's busy. What is it about? I said, well, tell him I have 3 hours of the real Jim Garrison, not the Kevin Costner Jim Garrison. And he should do a documentary with me about Jim afterwards. He could be executive producer. She goes away, comes back, says Oliver's still busy, but he would like you to send over the tapes. And I said, well, I would like you to send Oliver over because these tapes are not leaving this house. And I hung up. Anyway, I called Elizabeth Garrison, who was Jim's daughter. At this time, Jim's on his deathbed, been on his deathbed for a few months. So she's the go-between, the liaison. She says to me, have you ever heard of somebody named Rosie who works for Oliver Stone? I said, no, it doesn't sound familiar to me. She said, well, some lady identified herself as Rosie, called and suggested that my father not help me or the family help you do this documentary because I had a terrible reputation in Hollywood. So I said, what'd your father say? And she said, I told my father, and my father immediately almost sat up and said, you help John all he wants. So they were enormously cooperative. The material he gave me is beyond belief. So we did it. Now, this is how all weird things happen by accident. I have no money. I have this house that's worth almost $1 million, and I'm going to put it up for sale because I'm going to move probably to Nevada where there's no tax, and I don't know if I'd ever get another job, right? But I'd have enough money to last me a while. And 3 guys show up at the house, and they show up while I'm sitting in my living room screening the Garrison tapes. So I have to, on a big screen, I had one of the first people to have a big screen, and I freeze a picture of Garrison. These 3 guys come in. They're young men in their middle 20s. Their names were Brunson. And they were famous trumpet players in Utah. They were the Brunson brothers, and they were extremely successful among the Mormons. Anyway, they come by because I said for sale by owner. I didn't want to go through an agent. Really nice, decent, bright kids. And the older one looks at the screen and says, and sees the name Jim Garrison, and says, is that the guy that Stone's making the movie about? And I said, yes, that certainly is the guy. So they say, can we look at it a little bit? And I said, hey, hold a minute. You want to see the house or see my Jim Garrison stuff? No, just a couple of minutes. So they screen it. Anyway, I tell him afterwards, the purpose I'm selling the house, fellas, is that I want to get the money to finance this documentary. And they say, well, let me help you. And I thought, well, maybe they're rich Mormons. So I said, how can you help me? He said, well, we've been looking at houses all over Southern California, and we were up in the Hollywood Hills, and we saw a house that this kid just bought. He's about 32. His name is Lamar Card. He's the son of a wealthy tobacco magnate, and he wants to get into show business, so he came here and he bought this house, and we happened to see it. He said, what if we introduce you to him, and maybe he can help you? Well, Brent, this is the dumbest thing in the world. I mean, I just know these guys 8 minutes. I don't even know the guy on the hill they're talking about. The next day, the guy on the hill comes with somebody to the house, looks at the tapes and says, I have $200,000 for you. I mean, can you believe such nonsense?
Oh, my.
So we get together. Now, I sort of partnered with a guy named Freddie Weintraub. Freddie Weintraub was the guy that did Woodstock, was responsible for it being at Warner Brothers, and he discovered Bruce Lee, Enter the Dragon. So he used to own the Bitter End in New York. So anyway, I always liked him. A big bear of a guy, about 10 years older than I was, but I always liked him. Anyway, I went to him. I said, Freddie, you were involved with this Woodstock thing. I'm not a businessman at all. I'll leave this rest of it to me, but would you handle paying the bills and stuff like that? And here's $200,000, and I have more if you need it. So anyway, he ran the business end of it. I ran the creative. We shot it, okay? It turns out to be 90 minutes, and I have to leave stuff out that is so good. I mean, the guy who gave me orders to shoot, to Oswald to shoot Jack Ruby. I mean, so much stuff I had to leave out. Anyway, we do it. We screen it, and it gets an ovation at the film festival in Santa Monica. I mean, a standing ovation. It is a slam dunk Academy Award winner. And what happens is we had an original offer for Turner for $400,000 to air it, but when they saw it, they backed off of it. And what Freddie did is he got an offer from Cinemax because they were going to run it in tandem with JFK. What a brilliant idea. So it's the biggest ratings they ever get, right? So anyway, it's submitted for the Academy Awards, and the Academy calls and tells me, John, we can't accept it. And I said, what do you mean you can't accept it? You see the kind of reaction it's getting. They said, Freddie sold it to Cinemax. It went to television before it went to a theater.
Oh.
So what I did is I went to the Laemmle Theater, which is an art house theater in L.A., and I said, listen, I'll tell you what, I want you to screen this. You charge whatever you want. You keep the money. I just want the public to be able to see this, and maybe I will get a film distributor on my own. No publicity, nothing but word of mouth. In 3 days, 1,200 people jammed, standing room only, to watch this particular film. I did the same thing again in San Francisco, and then it goes to Spain, wins the San Sebastian Film Festival Award. I don't know if you've ever heard of a guy named Werner Herzog, a brilliant intellectual filmmaker. Mm-hmm. He invited me as his guest to Vienna to speak at the university there, gave me a citation. I went all over to Australia, every place. It's a massive hit. Can't get anybody here to screen it. It literally dies a horrible death. Yeah. And I end up every year sending notes to HBO, Cinemax, NBC, ABC. Now there are 100 cable channels. History Channel, which almost did The Man Who Killed Kennedy, and then they stopped doing that. Nobody would screen it, even free. So then what I thought, what am I going to do? So I look up on the computer the 12 leading assassination sites. I write to every single one of them, and I said, please put a link to the Garrison tapes on your site free for all your subscribers. Not one person would do it. Last year, I was invited by Judith Ferry Baker to go to Dallas to speak because a lot of my friends and fans write to these conferences and say, God, the most important voice in all of this is Jim Garrison. And the most important voice to talk about Jim Garrison is John Barbour, because that's the only guy Garrison would talk to. None of them would ever invite me. In Pittsburgh, Weck's son invited me to come and sit in the audience. So I declined. Anyway, I told Judith this is the one and only time I will do this. Now, when I got up there, you think I'm loud and angry here, and I'm sorry about that. But
no, not at all. Be yourself, my friend.
In Dallas, I told this crowd, I said, you folks are a waste of time. I said, you know, this afternoon, you all went down to Dealey Plaza for a moment of silence. You know who killed John Kennedy. Garrison told you in 1967 who killed John Kennedy. You do not need a moment of silence. You need a year of outrage. This is still an open case. Instead of being here in Dallas or New Orleans or Pittsburgh or Washington, you gather your dirty dozen groups together and meet November 22nd. Make it America's Bastille Day. Hold your meetings in front of the Justice Department. Get 10,000 people there every November 22nd, and then see what happens. This is the last time I will ever speak at one of these places, because I'm going to tell you something. If the CIA and FBI can get 1,000 people into the media, the CIA is the only branch of government that does its job properly. It is the only branch of government that keeps us in the dark about the truth of how they murdered John Kennedy and what they've been doing with all these fake wars since. And you know how smart they are? Half of the groups you support are run by people connected to the Central Intelligence Agency. Deborah Conway's husband is reputed to come from the intelligence service for crying out loud. And she has a good site called Lancer. It's a very good site. She turned me down. Not only did she turn me down, Len Osanic, who does Black Op Radio in Vancouver, calls her every year for her conference to say, why don't you come on and publicize your conference? She always refuses to come on because maybe she's afraid Len will ask her some tough questions. Okay, now, what happens? We get back to the Sinatra thing, okay? William Holden dies. And it's reported in the newspapers that he's had a heart attack. This very wonderful star, really terrific actor, Sunset.
Just watching The Wild Bunch last night.
Yeah, just Sam Peckinpah.
Yeah.
Sam Peckinpah called me and tried to kill me one night. But in any event, he dies, and nothing happens except that people are mourning. Then Thomas Noguchi performs the autopsy on Bill Holden. And what does Noguchi find? An excessive amount of alcohol in his bloodstream, and he concludes that Bill Holden in his condominium at Santa Monica got drunk, fell down, hit his head on the corner of a coffee table, and bled to death. Well, that comes out in the papers, and now there's a horrible outrage from Hollywood. How dare this Japanese interloper tell us about our American icon? And so we have this committee to save Noguchi, and a committee is formed by the Hollywood elite to get rid of Noguchi. And guess who they elect as their chairman? Frank Sinatra. I never got to talk to him again.
Oh.
Ever. So that was gone.
So
and,
Frank was that vindictive that he couldn't look past that?
Well, listen, Frank, I love him because I knew hundreds of superstars, and wealthy and rich and famous. Frank Sinatra and Neil Simon were the only two people I ever met who kept their word to me. All the others, it was all bullshit, because they lie for a living in that town. Okay, so anyway, it's gone, and I don't care. But the 50th anniversary comes along. I call Brokaw, my friend who got me my job at NBC. He's doing the thing for the military channel. I say, Tom, let me do 5 minutes on Garrison. He said, John, I love you, but no, I don't want Garrison on my show. I again offer it to everybody. Now, out of desperation, about 5 years ago, I just sent a note to George Knapp, who is the Sunday night host of Coast to Coast. Much better than Nuri, and a real journalist, an award-winning Ed Murrow kind of journalist. And I tell him about this, and he calls me up and he said, you're the guy from L.A., you did that Real People show. Yeah. He said, send me over the documentary. So I figured I'm not going to hear from him for a week. The next day he calls. He says, can you come on Sunday on my show? So for the first time, I get some coverage on Coast to Coast on a Sunday night with George Knapp, and bam, I'm hearing from everybody. Now everybody knows about it. Right now, the 50th comes along, and I'm struggling, getting rejections from everywhere. Netflix, Amazon, anybody that claims to be some alternative media turns me down. And I see accidentally Robert Kennedy being interviewed by Charlie Rose at the Weingarten Opera House in Dallas, and he says that privately his father did not believe the Warren report, but publicly had to say it. Now, you can't find him saying that anywhere, and Charlie Rose is forbidden to ever make his tapes public. So I called a friend of mine, Dick Russell, and I said, Dick, he wrote a great book, The Man Who Knew Too Much. And
he also works with Jesse Ventura a lot, too.
Yeah, he writes all his bestsellers.
Yeah.
He works with him. He writes the damn things.
Yeah,
and anyway, I call him and I say, I want to do this at a university on the 50th anniversary, okay? Because nobody will take it. It's a little too late. It's past November 22nd. I said, well, I'll do it in December. And I'll call it The Last Word because it's the last show about the assassination. Would you like to be a panelist on it? And then I'll call a couple of other people. And I said, you know what I'd like to do? I'd like to call Bobby Kennedy. I don't know how to get to him, but, see if he would come along and do this. And
Bobby Kennedy Jr., by the way, folks. Sorry, John.
Bobby Kennedy Jr. No, that's all right. Interrupt me all you want. And he said, I write with Bobby Kennedy Jr. aside from Jesse. We write stuff on the environment. We're very good friends. He said, I'll mention it to him. Tomorrow I'll call him. So he calls me back the next day and he said, He sounds interested. Here's his speaker's agent. His speaker's agency is a place called Kepler in Arlington, Virginia, and his personal agent is a guy named Sean Lawton. I call Sean, and he comes to the phone right away, and I'm stunned. I thought, well, maybe Bobby said something. Sean comes to the phone because the biggest fan of Real People, he said, was his mother. And if his mother knew that he was talking to Johnny Barbour, she'd bake cherry pies for him the rest of his life. So I told him what I wanted from Bobby, and he said, send me a copy of the film. So I send him the film. 4 days later, he calls me back. He's, John, this is wonderful. I'm coming to L.A. Can we get together at Musso Frank's and talk about this? So he comes out, and what it is that Bobby Kennedy wants his usual $25,000 fee. All I have left in the bank is $25,000, Brent. And I said, I'll give it to him. I'll give it to him. You know why? I won't hire any Dick Russell, anybody else to do this. I said, because I believe that Bobby can add no information to this case, not nearly as much as Joan Mellon or Jim Mars or Brent Holland or Dick Russell, but the fact that a Kennedy is there, the sin of Robert Kennedy, the emotional impact. I said, I will sell 1 million DVDs. I'll give half of the profits to him, but I'll have enough left over to do part 2 of the Garrison tapes, which is going to be called The American Media and the Second Assassination of President John F. Kennedy. And I have tons of material to prove it. The media will be shut down with shame when this comes out. So anyway, Bobby agrees. I agree to pay the $25,000, but he keeps waffling as to the date. And I call the university. They're going to give me everything free. They're so thrilled. Kennedy comes to town. I called George Knapp. I said, I'll give you $5,000 to interview him. He said, you won't give me a nick. He said, I'll give you $5,000. You mean the privilege of interviewing him in front of the Garrison tapes at UNLV, Robert Kennedy Jr., about his father's murder, his brother? He said, I'm yours, kid, whenever you want me. So we're all set up. They do artwork. They do everything. They do posters. The town's going nuts. And he keeps procrastinating. Then Dick calls me and he says, he hasn't seen the film yet. I said, God damn it, show him the film. It's the most important thing ever. He calls me 4 days later and said, Bobby thinks Garrison's a kook. And I said, after seeing that documentary? And he said he can't look at it. I said, you mean he believes what the government's been telling him, and privately his father did not believe it? What is wrong with the man? And I said, and you tell him about my involvement with Noguchi and the death and murder of his father. And you go on to tell him that I have done more to look into the death of his father than he has, and spoken up more publicly. I said, shame the son of a bitch. And I said, but do it in a nice, calm voice, okay? Well, he agrees at the last moment to do it. So we're scheduled for the 13th of December. December 11th, Dick calls me. Bobby's changed his mind. So now I have no show. I have nothing. And I wrote him a nasty note. I said, you send this coward this note, that if his uncle is in heaven writing a second version of Profiles in Courage, he is not getting one goddamn chapter in it, not even a sentence. And shame on him. He should be here for nothing, for crying out loud. It's the murder of his uncle, his father, and the murder of democracy in America. He's interested in cleaning up the environment. You cannot clean up the natural environment in America until you clean up the political environment. It is degrading, and that's where he should be focusing his attention. He's the only voice in America that can get that attention. And the reason he needed the $25,000, I was told, because he needs money. And I said, how can a Kennedy need money? But evidently the sister with $320 million is not friendly with him. So anyway, it's done and over with. So I called Dick back. I said, I'll give you $1,500. I'll give Joan $1,500. I called Jimmy Mars. I'll give you. They never get paid for this stuff. They do it always for nothing.
Absolutely. Yeah, they're terrific.
Your hotel, I'll feed you. I'll do all of it. Now, very honestly, Brent, I do not believe anybody can get up after watching the Garrison tapes and talk about anything and top the Garrison tapes. I have seen it 100 times, and I'm almost moved to tears every time I see it. Not because I made it, just it has that impact on me, okay?
Understand.
It's like hearing beautiful music over and over and over and over again. It gets right to your soul. After the screening, and by the way, there's additional new material in it, the piece from Jim finally, where he shows us how he tracked down the guy that gave the orders to Oswald to shoot. Did it actually in Dallas. Came to Dallas and sat down with Jack Ruby and gave him the orders. And the guy's son is in military intelligence, was in Dallas. And the guy's name was Lawrence B. Myers, a Chicago shady businessman. Anyway, that's all proven in that. So when it's over, it's now Joan and Jim and Dick's time to talk for 55 minutes. I must tell you, Brent, honestly, they topped the Garrison tapes. They were so thrilling. They were so theatrical. They were so informative and so exciting. Mm-hmm. I told them, put the three of them together and take it to Broadway. They could do a 3-person, 1.5-hour show. They would have standing room only. They were so wonderful. And as a couple of questions came from the audience, an 18-year-old kid said, he stood up and he said, I believe the CIA killed him, but why would they kill him in Dallas at noon? And Jim Mars spoke up right away, as did Joan, saying it was a public execution, son. It's their way of saying to whoever got into that office, their way of saying, you think you run the country? Think again, listen to this. It was like the great old Bill Hicks joke, that great comic who would have been better than Carlin, close to Lenny Bruce. He died at 33 of cancer. Maybe it wasn't an accidental cancer. He said, when the president of the United States is elected, the CIA and the Pentagon brass don't come over to the Oval Office to talk to him. They bring him over to Langley, Virginia, and sit him down, and they show him a film. Another view of the assassination, not done by Zapruder.
Exactly.
So, and you know, I keep thinking, there must have been satellites up in the air at that time. Maybe there's something on satellites that nobody's ever looked into, and nobody's ever asked that question, but it might possibly exist. So anyway, it's done. And all I can do is through a friend of mine James Griffith, a really bright guy, a cousin of Andy Griffith and Melanie Griffith. He has a small boutique press called Wordsmith Media. And he said, listen, we have stuff up on Amazon. You should get this on Amazon right away. So, Brett, I put it up on Amazon, where it is now. And every single day, word of mouth, for 2 years, it sells 1 or 2 copies. If your audience goes to Amazon and just Googles it, they can read almost 100 unsolicited reviews from people who went to the trouble to buy the DVD, watch it, and then come back and write a review. But if you don't have $14 to buy it, you can download it for like $2.20 or something. And if you have the ability to tape it, if you're downloading, tape it. I am telling you, folks, there are maybe a dozen of the best books in the world about the Kennedy assassination that are worth your reading. But if you're not interested in doing that dozen, if you get the last word on the assassination between the film, the audience, and this panel, the most exciting panel ever, you will know absolutely every single thing you need to know about the murder of John F. Kennedy and the death of democracy in America, the day that changed this country and the world forever.
John Barbour, folks, www.nightfrightshow.com. All his links to everything he spoke about will be there. And you can certainly link right up to that Amazon.com documentary. And just for a couple of bucks, you can download this. It's historical. It's essential. It's more than just informative. This is going to be the new benchmark for the assassination. John, when you were working with Sinatra, did you ever discuss the assassination with him? Did that subject ever come up?
No, I didn't want to scare him off, but
Okay.
I knew it's like there, the girl who was the singer that Sam John Connor dated. You know the one I'm talking about? She was part of a trio.
The three women there,
Yeah,
the sisters.
Yeah, I will think of her name in a minute. She was having an affair also at
Right.
the same time with Dick Martin of Rowan and Martin.
That's right.
And John Connor sent out some of his press agents to talk to Dick to discourage him. Either that or they were going to solder his zipper to his belt.
Press agents is a very politically correct word to use.
So anyway, she's still in this town. And she was going to be part of a celebrity.
McGuire sisters.
Yeah, that's right. Phyllis McGuire.
Yeah.
She was interviewed about 20 years ago, exactly when I first moved here, by Barbara Walters. And Barbara Walters said that when she went to Phyllis's house, there were 4 men with automatic weapons to greet her and stand around while she interviewed her. Okay? That must mean one of two things. She either has a lot of Sam's hidden money, which is probably true, or Sam told her something. And she is vowed to secrecy forever, otherwise she'd probably lose her life and her money. She's always talked about wanting to write a book, but she keeps putting it off. And I've often thought, I know George Knapp and I have talked about this often, because George wants to talk to her also, about going out there and sitting casually with her without a recorder or anything, and just asking her about Sam, how they met, their relationship, and then when she was really comfortable, what he might have said to her about John Kennedy. And I'm sure that she has an awful lot of information.
There's probably a whole well there that needs to be opened up, I would suspect, and I think that's a good strategy that both you and George have. The other question I have for you, Tom Snyder and yourself, when you worked together, did the subject of the assassination ever come up, and his belief?
No, Tom tried to really avoid anything serious. And Tom always promised me, like when I lost the AM show, he stopped me the night of the Emmys, and he said, "Kid, you are so good." He said, "I'd love to have you as a guest on my show." Well, he was doing a local show, and I never got to be a guest on a show. And then I was his colleague for 5 years at CNBC. As a matter of fact, also Brokaw's. And when Brokaw left to go to do to be their man in Washington, NBC came to me. They were going to go to the Beverly Hills Hotel and asked me if I would sort of do a roast of Tom while he was going to go back east. So I came and did a roast, and I must tell you, it was hilarious. People gave me an ovation when it was over. And one of the reasons was I was never like a comic, Brent. I mean, there are brilliant comics. You start with the physical ones like Shecky Greene and Jonathan Winters and Robin Williams, who was also very verbal. And then you have the old-time Henny Youngmans, "Take my wife, please," stuff like that. I just talked to people, and I hoped that I would write funny lines. So if you talk to people, they don't feel like you're trying to say anything funny, that you're forcing in, so they relax, because audiences are extremely insecure. They can sense fear or desperation right away. So I would just relax talking to people, and out would come some funny material. Anyway, the same thing happened with Snyder when he got the Tomorrow Show. But instead of talking about him at a private function, NBC asked me to review him on the air as part of my critique, my Critics' Corner. And so the room was full, and it was Tom's last broadcast and my last review with him. So I talking about him, and that it was a good thing that Tom got to do his newscast in the San Fernando Valley, surrounded by mountains that barely can contain his ego. I said, but let me tell you something. Tom Snyder has a kind of personality. He gives you the impression the news is there to bring you him. Well, you never have heard applause on a newscast in your life until this night. And the next day, it was in Time magazine. A lot of my stuff ended up being quoted all over the place. I never got credit for it, because maybe they didn't think I was a major force or a major star. But a lot of my stuff got credit all over the place for that. Now, I mentioned that I had that huge ovation with that thing at the Dean Martin show. But the biggest laugh I ever heard was Red Fox. Red Fox was my mentor, believe it or not. My wife used to sing with one of the immortal jazz pianists named Earl Hines. Earl Hines was part of the old Louis Armstrong sextet, but because of Louis' partying and stuff like that, it wasn't Earl's lifestyle. He moved out to San Francisco, built a big band, 12-piece orchestra, and my wife was the band singer.
Wow.
And still to this day sings great. So she knew them all. And she said I should meet Red Fox. And I went to see Red. Now, there are only 2 comics I've ever seen in my life who never died on stage. 3, actually. Red Fox, Jackie Mason, and myself. They became much more famous. I remember Jackie Mason's first appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show in 1956. His opening line. I mean, how can you remember that? He said he was the son of a rabbi. My father wanted me to be a rabbi. I want to get into show business, but I'm so insecure. I go to a football game when they huddle. I think they're talking about me. I mean, he was so funny. He could ad-lib like Red better than anybody. Anyway, people, and Red earned his living with these party records, and nobody would put him on the air because he was filthy. He was funny, but he was filthy. Anyway, I got my first. I had been put under contract at Merv Griffin's request for 6 months to Westinghouse to replace him, and they hired David Frost instead. Well, Metro Media thought that they made a mistake, and they did, and so they hired me to come and do a Saturday night show to keep me sort of around in case Westinghouse realized their mistake and might want me back. And so I did this poor man's Johnny Carson Tonight Show Saturday night, but it was a really good show. And I booked on the second show Charo, Rip Taylor, the crying comedian, Jack Carter, loud Borscht Belt comedian, and Red Fox. First time Red had been on television. These people all came out and did their stuff, and they were wonderful. Now, I knew Red's act, so I knew where to take him. But sometimes things slip out of my mouth that I don't want to, but it's just there, and my mouth beats my good sense, and out it comes. Anyway, it was at the time of the Black Power movement, and so it just 1969 or so. Yep. Anyway, Red comes out, and he sits down, and I asked him about the Black Power movement, what he thought about it. He said, I don't care about the blacks, and I don't care about the whites. The only power I care about green power. And I said, green power? And he says, green power. You have green power. You can buy the places where those whites and blacks hold their meetings. So it's the audience is really laughing. Now, this was a total ad-lib on my part. I don't know where it came from. And Brent, I said to him, and I was ashamed I asked him because I thought he had no answer. I said, Red, why do you think money's colored green? Without missing a beat, he says, that's because Jews pick it before it gets ripe. Oh. Well, oh my God almighty. We could barely finish the show, Brent. There were people falling on the ground, pounding the ground. The 2 or 3 of the people sitting to my right stood up and applauded and turned their back and left the stage. And about every 15 minutes, Jack Carter would stand up, take out his wallet, take out some money. He said, Red, green power. And it would start all over again. It was by far the biggest laugh ever in the history of television. Sadly, it was only on a local show. But
that's hilarious, John.
And I have it on tape.
Thank goodness for that.
Yeah, I have a lot of stuff on tape. I should probably put it back somewhere. But I've had a wonderful association with comics, and they've always been terrific to me.
John, where are we headed? We've only got 2 minutes left. Where are we headed? Where's the country headed? Where's the world headed?
Well,
I'm concerned like never before.
Well, you indeed have a lot to be concerned about. And the sad thing is, and the very honest thing, America improving is about as likely as Donald Trump getting a crew cut. Okay. And with that head of hair, he's going to make a lousy president, because it'll be so easy for the CIA to pull the wool over his eyes. You know what? Truthfully, it's gone. And the sad thing about it is we have many, many more informed individuals here in Canada and actually around the world. And the reason is this microphone that you and I are sitting in front of, this contraption that we are sitting in front of, thanks to Steve Jobs and a few other people, Bill Gates and the rest of them, has made the world an island, okay? But the tragedy is that we are forced to live in our own individual island. When I was growing up, there were social forces all over the place. There were unions, which Ronald Reagan has destroyed, and Bill Clinton further helped destroy, not only to destroy broadcasting by allowing corporations to buy as many stations as they want. You know, there were more than 1,500 owners of stations 20 some odd years ago. Then after Clinton, 6 corporations own 96% of all of America's corporations. And what else did this wretched human being do? He savaged the Glass-Steagall Act, which was instituted by Roosevelt to save capitalism from Norman Thomas and socialism in the 30s, to prevent the banks and investment corporations for doing what they did in America in 2008 when they bankrupted us. Now when they bail out corporations, they call it a stimulus. But you take an engineer who's lost his job and needs food stamps, they call it welfare. If it's a free enterprise system and General Motors can't make a car, God damn it, let them go out of business. So I have no positive words for you, but for me, it's like Charles Dickens' first line in Tale of Two Cities. It's the best of times and it's the worst of times. Now, for me, it has been like that, Brent, every day of my life because of my life. But I can only look at it as the best of times, because I looked at it as what it is. The worst of times, I couldn't go on. So I have to look at it as the best of times and seek the opportunities that are there. But look at, America's full of brilliant people. America's getting dumber and dumber and dumber and dumber and more stupid every day. And guess what? Some guy says, you know what? I'm going to write books about how dumb these people are and what they can learn. So I'm going to write Computers for Dummies. I'm going to write Politics for Dummies. So there's right.
John, there's the music. I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. It's truly been an honor. You're welcome here anytime, my friend. Thank you so much. I'm Brent Holland from Night Fright. See you all later.
You're listening to Night Fright and your host, Brent Holland. The time is now. Your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy.
The JFK Assassination, the definitive book by Brent Holland. From inside the Oval Office to Dealey Plaza, first-person witness accounts. Order yours right now, nightfrightshow.com.